And now I'd like also to introduce our next moderator for the panel, Brian Weeden, who's going to moderate the panel on pathway for developing rules for space logistics. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Very happy to be here. Hello, everybody. Greetings from cold and currently sleeting and a little bit of icy Washington, D.C. My name is Brian Weeden. I'm the Director of Program Planning for Secure World Foundation. For those that haven't not yet heard of us, we are a small US-based non-governmental organization that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of space for benefits on Earth. And it's because of the closeness of that mission with the topic of this conference that we are very happy to help co-sponsor this event with EPFL, and in particular put together this session. You know, from our perspective, we see a lot of promise that space logistics and satellite servicing holds for how we can, you know, more sustainably use space in the future and also derive more benefits from space that will help impact life here on Earth for the better. But in doing so, of course, there are lots of sustainability challenges we need to work through that we've been coming up here and there over the course of the last couple of days. So the purpose of this panel is to have a conversation about how we get towards developing some of the rules for space logistics, and I use that in air quotes because we're going to get into a little bit of what we mean by that and why rules may not always mean exactly what everybody thinks they mean, and how there are some different aspects to that. But that's the purpose of this panel. Just sort of lay an initial foundation before I introduce our speakers. You know, in the space world, so we have these agreed upon core principles that are enshrined in a set of foundational international space treaties. And we have several decades of mostly government practice in conducting space activities. And there are also a growing number of countries who put in place some national policies or regulations for space activities, but this is by no means universal. The key challenge we have is that this existing governance framework wasn't really designed to handle a lot of these emerging commercial space activities that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. Large constellations, rapid space launches, rapid growth in space launches, private space stations, even some cases lunar activities and private activities on the moon. And of course, within this concept of space logistics, things like debris removal, satellite refueling, repair, armament assembly, armament manufacturing, all are great things, but are not, in many ways, are not really covered under the existing governance framework. So for our panel today, we're going to start by walking through some of these underlying concepts and issues that are at play, and then talk about the path forward of how we can get towards a more coherent, a more substantial governance framework, rules for all these space activities. We're going to talk about the existing framework, the role of the government, the role of the private sector, and also how we can learn from other domains. So joining me in this discussion, I'm pleased to say we have three different experts who are all truly experts in their fields and bring different aspects to this conversation. First, I'm joined by Professor Tanja Masson-Zwaan. She's the Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University. Also President Emeritus or Emerita of the International Institute of Space Law, and is the adjunct faculty at International Space University and advises the Dutch government on space law issues. And in my opinion, one of the international space lawyers I respect the most. We also have Professor David Barnhart. He's the active research professor in the Department of Astronautical Engineering at the University of Southern California. He's also the director and co-founder of the USC Space Engineering Research Center, and a co-founder CEO of Archinard Incorporated. Dave specializes in developing innovative technologies and architectures for space morphologies, rendezvous and proximity operations, and does a lot of working with students in trying to educate them on these topics. And then finally, we'll have Dr. Natália Archinard. She holds the space portfolio at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. She's been leading the Swiss delegation to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS, for more than a decade, and serves as the chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of COPUOS through this year. Ms. Archinard has been representing the Swiss government in multilateral negotiations on space security and sustainability for the last several years. So with that, Tanja, I'm going to turn to you first. And so let's start at the top and work our way down here. If you could just sort of give us a broad overview of the international framework for space activities and governance and sort of what that means for the rest of the system as we look down.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Brian, and thank you for having me on this panel to you with the World Foundation and, of course, EPFL. We do have an international legal framework, and I'm pleased to see it has been alluded to several times over the past few days, even by the non-lawyers, although I presume that most of the audience are not legal experts, besides perhaps my own students who are watching. But yes, we do have, since actually the space age started in 1957, right away the United Nations was on top of it and created a committee. You mentioned it already, Natália, as chairing one of its subcommittee, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is a permanent committee of the United Nations, and which elaborated a number of treaties, legal instruments, 5 treaties we have, as well as a set of number of sets of principles and resolutions and other non-legally binding, as we call them, instruments. So there is a general framework law composed both of binding and non-binding law. I must say that since the 1980s, the instruments that were adopted by COPUOS by consensus, which means that everybody has to agree for something to be adopted, have mostly been in the form of non-legally binding. So it is more in the form of guidelines and code of conduct. I'm sure we will be discussing that later on during this panel. But that is a little bit a reflection of the current geopolitical climate and the status where countries are more hesitant to, let's say, to restrain, to give up their sovereignty by agreeing to a legally binding treaty. That does not mean that these rules are of less value, and I'm referring specifically here to the UN debris mitigation guidelines and the most recent achievement of the COPUOS, the long-term sustainability guidelines, which will be referring to later as well. But those main principles that we have in the treaties, and I'll just refer to a few of them to give you a flavor. The first principle is that outer space is free for exploration and use by all states on a basis of equality for the province of mankind, humankind. And so that is the basic premise of states to adhere to. States are also not allowed to appropriate outer space. You cannot own a part of outer space, celestial body, or you cannot have sovereignty. International law applies to activities of states. There is a system of state responsibility and state liability. That responsibility is specifically important in the context of today's topic because it means that states have to authorize and continuously supervise the activities of their private entities, and that's the whole reason why we have such a growing body of national space legislation. There is also the principle of doing Barnhart, and that you should not interfere with the activities of that can be of special relevance when we're talking about satellite servicing, for instance. So you mentioned it already, Brian, there is a whole set of challenges, congestion, competition, it is becoming full, there is debris, there are numerous problems that we have, there are many more actors, many non-state actors that are now in the field. So we do need to have some additional rules to fill in those basic principles that we have, and especially in the field of satellite servicing. I think the questions that are relevant, you know, they deal with that question of responsibility, but also liability. What is fault if something goes wrong? The concept of dual technology, every aspect of a space have a military aspect, but can also be purely civilian. national security aspects may play a role. So there are many questions that we need to address, and maybe I'll keep this short and not go any further now. But just to summarize, that there is a legal international framework, the basis for future work. I think I'll leave it to that.
Sorry, trouble unmuting there for a second. Thank you very much, Tanja. That's a great overview. And as you mentioned, a big part of this under the national legal framework gives nation states a lot of the responsibility for the supervision and oversight of national space activities. So I'll turn to Natália, as someone who works for a national government and has involved some of these issues. Can you sort of talk a little bit about how states approach these international obligations through the national regulations, policies, sort of what that's like, and sort of where states are headed in how they look at space activities and space governance?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Brian, for the kind introduction and for having me on your panel. And thank you also very much for EPFL to EPFL for this very interesting symposium, which I have attended in the last 2 days. Well, how do states implement their international obligations? That's a broad question in the sense that it is quite varied, quite differentiated how states do implement their international obligations. Well, the Outer Space Treaty has about 120 member states parties to it, so this is quite of a universal instrument. Yet the way states do implement it, as well as the other instruments they are parties to at national level, is quite different. And I wouldn't like to enter into details here. And suddenly Tanja is much more knowledgeable about this than I am. But what I'd like to emphasize is maybe, and as a non-lawyer, maybe a remark from the outside, is the fact that there is no enforcing authority for those UN treaties, makes it that there is that the motivation to implement the obligations are different from state to state. And as we have mentioned already, heard in the last 2 days, and Tanja has alluded to it, the space is extremely strategic for states, be it in terms of defense, of having military capabilities, of ensuring national security, and well, domination in space means domination on Earth. So and now we see the huge development of commercial actors, private actors in space, and going with that, the huge commercial interest states may have for space, and for letting their private sector develop and conduct activities in space. So from my point of view, which is more the diplomatic and political point of view, the challenge is to create incentive for states and for all space actors to implement the international obligations, the legal obligations, but also the soft law obligations, the non-legally binding ones. So all guidelines, standards which are or have been developed by the UN, by UN COPUOS in particular, but also by other entities. And I'm referring to, well, the IADC guidelines, for instance, or other kind of guidelines. And international law related to space, which shall not be forgotten. That is what is happening under ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. So the radio regulations, for instance, are legally binding for states parties to it, and that's quite a strong instrument for the coordination of frequency, for instance. So yes, I think what I'd like, maybe if I still have a few seconds, Brian, just go a bit further in the reflection. How can we create incentive, or how it's not, sorry, when I say we, it's not we to create incentive, or maybe it is in part, but what I find very interesting is that there are a lot of initiatives emulating around the world from the different sectors, and not only from the governments, but also from the private sector mainly, but also from the space agencies themselves, or from the academic sector, which is developing standards, which is launching initiatives to, for instance, for a better exchange of orbital information, to increase the knowledge of what's happening up there, for instance, to increase the accuracy of the prediction concerning collisions, potential collisions, for instance. But all of this has to be backed up by an international, how to put this, architecture, which will help use this information and coordinate among satellite operators, so that collisions among satellites can be avoided, for instance, in an effective manner and in a equitable manner. So well, in a nutshell, I think as we've heard, it's difficult to make progress at intergovernmental level towards new legally binding instruments, and suddenly and even towards non-legally binding instruments. So in this context, it's the initiatives brought up by the private sector, by civil society, are very useful to make progress overall. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. So Dave, I want to turn to you, because we just mentioned sort of the role of the private sector in all of this, and that's sort of what I wanted to have you sort of add to this discussion so far. We talked about sort of international treaties, we talked about sort of national laws and policies. The other piece of this is best practices, standards, those sorts of things, and there we've seen the last several years quite a lot of efforts for the private sector to play a role in trying to establish some of those and set some of those. So Dave, I know you could talk a little bit about that. You've been involved in some of those activities, and also how this is done in other industries, right? Because obviously the space world is not the first one to struggle with some of these challenges, and I think we're all used to Wi-Fi as a standard and USB as a standard, and there are roles they play. So Dave, you could sort of talk about the private sector role in some of this and the role of standards, please.
Yeah, appreciate it. Good morning, Brian. Hi, Natalie and Tanja. Good afternoon, and everybody else. Really appreciate it, and thanks for EPFL for hosting this. It's also cold here in California, and it's interesting. The word "cold" here in California means if you can't put your bathing suit on and get into the water, it's cold. So what's fascinating is that decries a norm associated with a word that may be different in different places, which is sort of fascinating, which is potentially a topic of what we're talking about. Standards. So that becomes an interesting question. I was lucky enough to support Brian specifically in development of this thing that we called CONFERS, and we attempted to attack that from sort of different approach, which was what exists today in space or up to today, and then if something doesn't exist, is there a way to look at other industries that might provide some inspiration for it, as an example. There is no such thing as a USB connector for space. There is no such thing as a standard connecting set of grappling hooks to go grab things in space, because this is all new. It doesn't exist, right? We tried to do a survey of sort of other domains, the aircraft domain, the shipping domain, the trucking domain. One that was interesting that we actually centered on and looked at, and I think is a good example, is it's a commercial consortium. It's called the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. and here it's in the United States. It was started about the time that NAFTA came into being, where you've got Canada, the US, and Mexico all creating this trade agreement, but that also meant that you had a greater preponderance of freedom of movement of these trucks back and forth, right? 3 different countries, 3 potentially different standards associated with the connection devices for the trailers. Wow, okay, that's interesting. So it turns out that in the US, there's a federal motor carrier standard that basically says, if you're a truck and you're pulling a trailer, ye shall have a safety device on it. That's great. Yeah, sounds wonderful. Doesn't say what it is, doesn't give any specifications, right? So the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance came into being, and they basically took it to the next level, to the point where, as an example, they would say that if you're going to install one of these safety devices, you shall use a 5/8" bolt. Forgive the blasphemy of using imperial units. I apologize. That's what's listed for them. Instead of, and if you use 1/2 inch, then you use 14, right? So this consortium actually took it upon themselves to take the notional sort of standard or desire that you shall be safe, and they tried to codify it in terms of actual engineering instantiations. So I thought that was really interesting, and that there may be an analogy that we could apply into the space realm in some sense. So that was sort of the thing that we came up with relative to what's commercial at the point on another group that might be applied to space. So.
No, that's great. And so I think what we're sort of trying to get at here is that there's at a very course level, 3 different sort of levels where we need to think about rules, right? We have the international level, the treaty level, sort of between governments, we then have sort of the national policy regulatory level, and then there's sort of this industry level standards, and all 3 sort of interact with each other. So I think, Tanja, I want to go back to you and sort of, maybe expand a little bit on sort of how these things sort of influence how countries think about or apply international law, right? Is, or even I'll ask you this a little more interesting question. Do we start with the law and then sort of work our way down, or is there also a way for things to filter up, sort of like from an industry perspective, that then eventually makes its way into the law?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Always you can look top, bottom, or up, bottom up or top down approaches and see what works best. I think it should go sort of hand in hand. And I think that is what you see happening. And if you look, for instance, at the space resources topic, for instance, and you had industry that came knocking at the door and said there are no definitions in the treaties. We have no certainty whether we can own the resources, as opposed to we cannot own the soil. We need clarity. So the United States made a law, and then UN COPOL started discussing it and put the topic on its agenda. So and the industry came to the table, and we had working groups and all kinds of initiatives. So you need that interaction, I think, and it is really essential to have that. We have now a landscape where private industry is maybe not the main player, but a very important player at the table. And so you do need to know what their needs are, what their questions are, and they need legal certainty. And my experience is that they do not want to operate in a lawless environment, so they are not necessarily against being regulated, as long as the regulation is reasonable, doesn't take up too much of their time, so that they can't build technology, that it is not too costly. All these things have to be taken into account. So the building of norms should go hand in hand with all these players. But in the end, I do think that it is essential that there is some kind of international coordination, because otherwise you could have a rule that says, okay, we have to all drive on the same side of the road. But then one country says we're going to drive left and the other says we're going to drive right. So it might be nice to all drive on the same side. And especially if you talk about space traffic management or whatever, where everybody is in the same environment, it is desirable that we all follow the same norms. And that's why I do think also that forum that we have, even though sometimes it is criticized as being slow or too hierarchic or too diplomatic or whatever, like couples, it is very valuable to have that international coordination, so that in the end you can all follow sort of the same rules. But coming into being, I do think that you need all the players around the table.
Yeah, and you know, the whole different countries having different rules for where to drive in the road works when you can't when you are separate countries, right? But in space, obviously that's sort of a challenge because you're all interacting together. So Natália, the other piece I want to bring, I want to work in is, you know, you were involved in a discussion within UN COPIUS that just concluded back in 2018, 2019 on developing sort of guidelines for space sustainability, which sort of I think is relevant to this because it talked about how do we do a better job of thinking about space debris, of thinking about national supervision of space activities, of sort of, you know, sharing data. Can you talk a little bit about that process and sort of, you know, how as a state in that process, how you saw sort of what the industry was doing, and to the point you raised earlier, sort of how you influence or sort of incentivize other countries or even your industry within that process?
Well, yes, thank you, Brian. I think, well, indeed, this the long-term sustainability guidelines, 21 guidelines developed by UN COPUOS over almost 10 years and adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2019. So it looks like a long time for 21 guidelines, but the value of this result shall not be underestimated because of all the difficulties and interests we have mentioned before, and which really recall us how competitive space is. But certainly it's a very broad. Those guidelines, they are addressing broad aspects. I mean, you've mentioned it, Brian, encouraging the implementation of regulatory framework, authorization, surveillance, improving the enhancing the registration of space objects with the UN, which is also a transparency measure, and I'd like to emphasize the importance of building trust among states, and that goes through transparency. So publishing national space policies, for instance. So the guidelines, I believe, well, you mentioned also the role of the private sector in it, and certainly, even if the private sector is rarely sitting itself in the rooms where those negotiations among states are taking place, sometimes there are delegations which include representative of the private sector in their delegation. So they are at the table, the people, the persons are at the table also. But still, even if the people on the private sector is not physically present to these negotiations, it may be, or it is up to the governmental delegations to bring their positions, their views, the views of the private sectors into the discussion, and that comes very strongly from some countries at COPUOS. Now, yet still there is, I would say, there is a need for a better interplay between what is being done by the private sector, by the academic sector, for instance, and what is being tried at intergovernmental level. And this is a difficult interplay, because when we say the private sector or the academic sector, from which country is that? Which university or this company, in which country is it established? So other states may not see that company from this other country, may not be happy to have it at the table or to have to follow the best practices elaborated by that company or by that group of companies. So that is also the challenge, and that is a more general challenge, I would say. We've heard also the last days, isn't it easier to develop a new set of rules among a smaller group? Because obviously we are less people, less states, maybe like-minded, friendly states. So it's easier to get a common understanding. And that's obvious. And that's what states are doing. And that is good. So that is good as a first step, because in the end, and as Tanja recalled, we are all I mean, space actors are all operating in the same environment, and that is the challenge. That is the reason why there is a need for some coordination at global level, international level, with all actors in space, so that the rules are coherent, so that they do not create further dangers, risks, further threats, and so that the set of rules is and so that there is also predictability for all actors, including the private actor.
No, and so an example of that, for example, in the air world, we have ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is charged with setting international standards and safety protocols for air traffic, but then that are regulated and implemented at the national level. So that's an example of something, and people have talked about whether we have an ICAO for space, but there's I think quite a few steps we have to get through before we get to that point, because as I mentioned earlier, there's still a lot of countries that don't actually have that sort of national implementation administrative entity that can sort of do some of that. I want to turn now to, we've got about 10 minutes or left. I want to go back to Emmanuel and see if there's any audience questions that have come in, because I've got a whole bunch of questions I can ask you guys, but I want to see what the audience has sort of said so far.
Yeah. Hello. Thanks, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for your great remarks. There's a lot of questions. I think we'll not be able to answer all, but I'll try to do my best. First question, in your opinion, what should be improved in the international legal framework related to space traffic management to ensure the safe coordination of the 100,000 satellites that are planned to be launched in the 10 years? I think it's a great question, because Natália mentioned that 21 guidelines, it took 10 years to come, and now we have 100,000 of satellites coming in 10 years.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think how long do we have left? We have 4 hours left to debate this question. So I'll Tanja, ask you to maybe comment on that first, sort of, what does the international legal framework say about these 100,000 satellites? Is there anything rules at that level, or can you just maybe start there? We'll go from there.
Yeah, every object that is launched into outer space has states have obligations to register them. They have to be coordinated in the sense that, of course, they have to get their frequencies, and there's a whole ITU process that Natália referred to earlier. And then you are responsible for them, and the ownership over that object is quasi-eternal. So if it collides with something else, you could be held liable for damage. So this concept of large constellations is putting a lot of pressure on the system that we have. We currently have a number of objects that are registered in the UN registry. That is an obligation under international law that you register your objects. I don't see how that system can handle when 100 satellites are launched at the same time as we're seeing now, and when constellations of what is the plan, 42,000 or something, are going to be launched. So we are going to have to make some adapting to that system. Can we block register? But what would that mean in terms of jurisdiction and control? I don't really think that the system that we have now is going to be foolproof to deal with that, and we may have to be pragmatic in making some adapting and facilitating some way of dealing with that in a more pragmatic manner. I'm not sure what the answer is, but we will have to look at it.
Yeah, and just I should have mentioned earlier, all these constellations are primarily licensed by the nation state that they're sort of entities in. So, for example, Starlink is being licensed by the United States. The OneWeb is being licensed by the UK. There's a couple of Chinese commercial proposals will be licensed by those entities. And those national regulators generally set sort of what the rules for debris mitigation would be. One of the challenges, however, though, is that in the US, the regulator is the Federal Communications Commission for these large constellations, who primarily looks at radio frequency spectrum. I think what you mentioned earlier, I think it was Natália about the ITU. That's the only entity right now in the US that has oversight of these constellations, and their primary focus is spectrum. Now they're doing some debris mitigation, but the big question is, should there be specific debris mitigation requirements for these large constellations? And there's been an ongoing process the last several years in the US, a public comment period, long sort of drawn out process for creating national rules that is not yet finalized. And yet we have 1,000 satellites that are now up from Starlink. And so that's sort of the challenges here. Dave, you want to come in?
Thanks. I was going to exemplify that even further. It's even more interesting because, as an example, the U.S. licensed a U.S. flag company, Starlink, to go put up their satellites. They put up their satellites from the United States, and then there was a huge outcry from the International Astronomy Group, because now they're streaking through the sky and cutting up, the visual observations that occurs from astronomy. There was no regulatory process related to that. There was no discussion about what it was. And the key word there is international astronomy, right? What they did in space covers everything. Now, the more interesting thing that's happening is this particular company has decided, let's try to dampen the signature of the satellites so that it's not seen quite so much from the ground to satisfy that problem, which now makes it fascinating, that it makes it less likely that you can see the bloody satellites when you're trying to track them for space traffic management. So it's just the technology is moving so quickly, and there's no regulatory agency that we're sort of setting up these problems that go. So I just wanted to raise that. It's fascinating.
Natália? Yeah.
I had to be unmuted. Thank you. There is one perspective I like to bring into this conversation, which is, and that may be an approach with which we could use the existing international law, which is access to space, freedom of access to space, right? And if we look at these large or huge constellations, they are going to use a specific region, orbital region around the Earth, and with the risk to saturate them or to use the full capacity of this region, meaning access to this region will not be possible for other operators. So this is an approach where we could have we could use existing international law, but obviously, I mean, is there a political will, right? Because that's a lot of money behind this, and that's why the authorization is given. So that's really, and that's a good example because it shows the ambivalence between preserving space for the long-term use, for equitable use by all states, and in commercial interest of a few.
Yeah, no, and Tanja, go ahead. And I think what you're going to do is, may this qualify as appropriation, which is illegal under the Outer Space Treaty, but that's a very interesting sort of interpretation of what that might mean.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would qualify that as appropriation. I do think that requires some kind of intent to really own it permanently. But what I do think is that this really goes back to the obligation of states, to that responsibility obligation, authorization and supervision. That does not mean that you just put a stamp on anything that is commercially interesting. It is actually a responsibility to also weigh the interests of other stakeholders. Astronomy is science. Science is paid by public funding, and so it should be a weighing, a balancing of the interest, and that is initially, in any case, a responsibility of the government authorizing this activity. And if that is not done properly, you can have a discussion at the international level to see whether indeed the access to space is not open or whether there is no due regard for the activities of other states. And I believe that this will be on the agenda of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee that's coming up. I do believe that there is a need to weigh those interests. It's a very interesting topic that is gaining a lot of traction at the moment.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Emmanuel for another question in the time we have remaining, but just to add yet another layer of complexity, these countries also need to get licenses from every country they want to offer services in. So another wrinkle of this, there's a company called AST that wants to do very large satellites in LEO to kind of do a cell phone tower in space. They're being licensed through Papua New Guinea, but they want to apply for market access in the US. So the US government might be able to apply different restrictions to them if they feel Papua New Guinea isn't necessarily living up to some of those considerations, or another country might do it if they think the US isn't doing it, for example, with Starlink. So to your point, Tanja, it gets interesting at the national level. Emmanuel, back to you for another question.
Yeah, I think I have some questions that are more focused on the enforcement of international law. So I have viewers that mention, for example, that China, Russia, USA, and India have intentionally shot down satellites in orbit for military demonstration, which had in orbit. So how do we enforce good behavior from governments? And there's also another example from another viewer also saying that there is a lot of debris that are linked to the Cold War, linked to Soviet military activities, and Russia are denying also their responsibility regarding those debris. So maybe the panelists can give a word on how what are the international legal tools to push the enforcement of those rules.
So yeah, got two good questions. I'll make two quick points and I'll turn it over to the other panelists that want to join in. First, I'll say that generally most of these legal frameworks exempt military activities sometimes. For example, the ITU exempts military transmitters. The international ICAO exempts state, i.e. military aircraft. And then on the other one, the good point to the last panel, Muriel's question, she got about how do governments incentivize removing debris? I'll just point out 90% or so of the existing space debris is government space debris that was created by the government. So part of this is how do we motivate the governments to clean up their own stuff, not just the commercial stuff. But I'll turn it over to anybody else who wants to comment on this. Tanja, do you want
to? I'm still unmuted, right? Yeah. Enforcement of international law, it's always a question. It's a question that comes up very often. And the way international law works, and Natália referred to it several times, is a lot by political will and by conviction. And I come back to that fact that space is so strategically important for everyone on Earth that the great majority of states do behave and comply with the rules. On the subject of satellite servicing or on-orbit servicing or debris removal, you do definitely need an incentive because it costs. It will take away useful lifetime from the satellite. So countries could give certain incentives in means of lowering the fees or giving insurance benefits or things like that could incentivize this. Otherwise, I do not see that companies at least would do it willingly, and for countries, for governments, I think it would be equally helpful. But on the other hand, that shared view that space is strategic for everybody, and you see that the debris guidelines are being observed by governments, by agencies, for the most part. So I'm not too pessimistic.
Yeah, David and Natália.
Yeah, just a real quick sort of observation. The two questions were responsibilities by the government. Several governments have actually attempted to do ASAT kinds of tests and validate it, and either you do it at the right altitude and therefore everything comes down, or if you go a little bit above that, then unfortunately there's populated debris. That's been demonstrated, so we'd like to think that they would be sort of calm about that. The other one is this notion of debris, and Brian's right. Most of the debris, as we call it, came from a government-sponsored mission from all over the world. I was lucky enough to have done some studies and worked with the University of Maryland, and also DARPA did a study years ago, I think it was called Catcher's Mitt, that identified that you can take out 5 of the really large boosters of rockets that are honestly sort of waiting bombs, if you will. In case something hits it, then that would generate more debris. If you could take those out, you could begin to lower the probability that you would eventually populate with debris. So there's a lot of interesting things related, unfortunately, tied to the government.
Yep. Okay. Natália, a quick last word.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think it's good that we expand a bit the discussion towards what is called security in space, right? Stability, avoiding war in space. And certainly ASAT tests are very worrying with respect to what concerns the production of space debris, but also with respect to the instability it creates with respect to peaceful users of outer space. So just for information, yeah, there are attempts to or proposal to have norms limiting assets that's proposed by the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. I'll try to be quick. Active debris removal, Muriel in her talk before, she alluded to it. It's dual, I cannot say it, dual use technology. So with having strong political or security aspects related to it. And such discussions are also taking place, part of it is because as we see it, ADR is useful for enhancing the sustainable use of space. So that is discussed at COPWAS. But ADR as a concern or a security component, which is discussed at the Conference on Disarmament or at the UN General Assembly First Committee. And as a last word, there were attempts, as I mentioned, the UNIDIR assets norms. There was also an attempt by the European Union for an international code of conduct, which also aimed at limiting the production of space debris. So there are several attempts, but again, we need the political will behind and the consensus by all spacefaring nations, which is the difficulty.
Always is. Well, thank you very much. Please, everyone, join me in virtually thanking my panelists. Emmanuel, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for this really interesting insight. And I think we all understood that it's quite a complicated topic, and that we got now also better understanding of those rules and on developing rules for space logistics. Now I would like to invite you for a 5-minute break. It was a lot of intense discussion and talks, so we need a bit of fresh air. And then we'll continue with the panel discussion, a sustainable space legacy for next generation. And while thinking about next generation, during the break, we'll feature a video of one of EPFL students, Galactic Chloe, and so you can have a first hint of what is EPFL next generation. Thank you.